Welcome to another alternate history video. This week though, we're doing something a little bit different. Instead of my usual videos where I try to paint a realistic scenario, trying to explore some real history within my alternate history scenarios, today I will be presenting an unrealistic alternate history scenario which I just wrote for some fun. Sit back and enjoy. We find ourselves in an alternate 1808 where Napoleon invades Spain in a bid to subdue Iberia into his more direct empire, installing his brother as the new Spanish monarch. This would cause turmoil to erupt across the Spanish Empire as a guerrilla war in Iberia would erupt. The Iberians would find support from Britain against the French, but that didn't stop the colonies from seizing this opportunity for civil unrest. Independence fighters were rising up across the Spanish Empire, while even Spanish loyalists were conflicted over whether to recognize the new Napoleonic king of Spain. Our story, however, concerns itself with Mexico. Rebel General Agustin de Iturbide quickly rises the ranks of the independence fighters, becoming the de facto leader of the Mexican rebel forces. After winning several engagements, he manages to gain control over a significant chunk of Mexico, most notably managing to control the sparsely populated north. Meanwhile, across the borders, we have the American and the British fight out the War of 1812. The Americans declare war, fumble an invasion of Canada, and see their capital get burned down until they repel the British again, leading to a temporary pause in fighting, as Britain was too busy focusing on kicking Napoleon's ass. But before we dive into the scenario, I want to introduce today's sponsor, Blinkist. With Memorial Day coming up, Blinkist is the perfect tool to help you understand and connect to the sacrifices made by the brave soldiers serving the US Army. By offering educational and entertaining 15-minute summaries of over 5,500 non-fiction books and podcasts, which you can listen to wherever you go. I have personally used Blinkist to listen to The Gun Debate by Philip J. Cook and Christine A. Goss, which explores the complex issues of gun control within the United States. A debate which is deeply interlinked to questions about the role of our military and its place in society. Blinks like these offer a unique and meaningful way to honor all the sacrifices made by those who served our country on Memorial Day. Blinkist has also recently introduced the new feature Blinkist Spaces. This allows you to create a space with friends and family where you can recommend titles to each other. All members of a shared space can access all titles in that space with or without a Blinkist premium subscription. As a limited Memorial Day offer, you can get a 7-day free trial and a 50% off Blinkist annual premium by using my promo link, which can be found in the description and in the comment pinned below. This offer is only valid until May 29th, 2023, so don't miss out. With that said, let's get back to the video. Once the British get this squared away, they refocus their attention on North America, launching a new invasion of New Orleans, defeating and killing Andrew Jackson, inflicting a massive morale defeat upon the Americans. From here though, Britain fails to capitalize upon their momentum, with the front lines going back and forth around Louisiana as the Americans refuse to negotiate. Spain, in an attempt to win favor with the British in their colonial wars, declare war on the United States as well, would quickly see their control over Florida taken away, only embarrassing Spain further on the world stage. This is where the Mexican War of Independence and the War of 1812 overlap into what we now know as the American War of the Nations. Agustin de Iturbide fears that, despite the Spanish failures to actually help the British may just help defeat the Mexican rebels out of thankfulness for the Spanish gesture. For this reason, Mexico declares war on the United States as well, launching minor invasions into the sparsely defended Louisiana territory to win favor with the British as well. The bulk of his forces were obviously still involved in combat within Mexico proper, but the minor Mexican gains in Louisiana, as well as the threat of further Mexican involvement, lowered American morale even further. And at this point, it was too much for the Federalists of New England to take. They had been against the war with Britain from the very beginning, releasing the Hartford Declaration in 1815, which denounced the war and even threatened New England's secession. With the war now decidedly being stacked against the US, but the US government still refusing to negotiate, the Federalist-dominated states in the northeast secede with British backing, forming the Confederation of New England. The United States declares war on the new state, but neither side seeks to take offensive action against the other. With America now at war with all of their neighbors, and even seeing their own territory secede, pretty much everyone realized it was time for peace. The British hoped to repeat the success of the Treaty of Vienna by calling for a conference in New Orleans. Representatives of Mexico, Britain, Spain, New England, the United States, and the Native Confederation met in New Orleans to discuss the future of North America. Much like France during the Treaty of Vienna, the United States was not to be treated as a fully defeated nation, instead making the United States an equal negotiator at the meeting. The borders of this conference would lead to the North America we know to this very day. This Treaty of New Orleans would come to be known as the Great Compromise, as all sides had to take some and then leave some. Mexico had wanted to gain all of Louisiana, under the argument that France had no legitimacy to sell the territory to the United States, since the territory officially belonged to Spain at the time. Mexico, claiming itself as the continuation of the Spanish North American territory, claimed the territory for itself. Similarly, Spain went to the conference with a vain hope that the US and Britain would support the return of Spanish control over Mexico, and if possible, all of Louisiana as well. The Native Confederation, then, simply wanted their borders and independence restored. The same goes for New England. The US wanted Louisiana, the restoration of their authority over New England, control over the Native Confederation, and if possible, Florida as well. Finally, Britain had no clear territorial goals, simply wanting to rebuild the North American continent in such a way that British power cannot be contested again. But before negotiations began, the New England delegates stormed out. The United States had demanded that the New England delegates would only be present as observers, as officially New England didn't actually exist yet, since nobody had fully recognized them. The United States had flat out refused to attend the conference if New England was there as a full negotiating partner. As a compromise, New England entrusted Britain to fight for their independence at the conference. Similarly, Spain had attempted to boycott the meeting if Mexico was allowed in, but at this point, nobody cared enough for the Spanish power projection, and Spain had to back down. Spain would be the power that can be described as the true loser of the Great Compromise. They had to recognize Mexican independence, pretty much fully destroying the Spanish presence on the North American continent, as Gran Colombia had broken free by this point as well. The next issue to settle was the Louisiana territory. The big debate was about whether or not France had the authority to sell the territory to the United States, or if France illegally seized the territory from Spain, thus declaring the purchase null and void. It was eventually decided that the purchase was in fact illegal, but the United States was still allowed to keep some land, while Mexico, now recognized as the legitimate authority in formerly Spanish North America, gets to keep the rest. The issue of the Native Confederation was also discussed, where again, compromise wins the day, as the Native Confederation gets to survive but loses territory to the United States. Additionally, Florida was granted to the US as well, to ensure that the US didn't feel like a totally defeated nation. Next up was the issue of New England, as the US completely refused to recognize their independence, and despite British pressure, the US held firm in this position. A status quo was finally created, where officially the US still didn't recognize New England, but Britain implicitly made it very clear that they would support New England if it came to it. So, with this new map, the American War of Nations, or as it's sometimes known, the War of the Three American Superpowers, was over. But which superpowers is this referring to? The first two may be obvious, the US and Mexico. But who is the third? Britain? New England? The Native Confederation? No. The third superpower has yet to reveal itself, but it would in 1824, 4 years after the Conference of New Orleans. The US had continued to claim and threaten both the Native Confederation and New England, leading to both nations deepening their defensive ties with Britain. Meanwhile, the British colonies in Canada had a massive surge in nationalism, as they felt like the victory against the US was mostly their doing. Britain, now wanting to focus on their holdings in India, grabs the opportunity to create a new North American nation, strong enough to at least hold the US back for long enough that Britain can mobilize and defend the territory, essentially outsourcing the first line of North American security to Canada. The Canadian Confederation would begin with just Canada proper, but soon New England and the Native Confederation were added with a lot of self-governance. Canada was still a part of the British Empire, but they were largely self-governing from this point forwards. Obviously, since this new nation had to house the natives, New Englanders, Anglo-Canadians, and Quebecois, this nation was a mostly decentralized state. This new Canadian state soon got into conflict with the Mexicans over the Oregon Territory, leading to British arbitration once again adjusting the borders on the continent. With this, we have our three North American superpowers. Let's meet them. Mexico is a largely backwards agricultural society, being an emperorship under the Iturbide dynasty. The monarch is somewhat held back by the constitution, which grants some civic freedoms to the population, but in terms of political power, calls for democracy were brutally repressed and the monarchs were all-powerful. With its massive size though, Mexico was on the forefront of the massive immigration movement to the New World by giving out free land to poor Europeans, treating the immigrants well as long as they didn't call for political reforms. This would turn Mexico into the most populated of our North American states, with a massive agricultural economy which remains the backbone of the nation to this very day. The monarchs, purposefully, restricted rampant industrialization in the nation, since it was considered that farmers made for worse revolutionaries than city dwellers and industrialists. Despite their industrial backwardness, Mexico, by virtue of their population, had the largest army and was a true North American superpower. Then we have Canada. Canada is the liberal paradise of the continent. Founded by Britain as a democracy, their federal nature ensured great respect for different nationalities and languages, as despite it being a primarily Anglo nation, it also held many native and French-speaking regions. Natives were put on equal footing to the Europeans in the nation, and the federal government officially apologized for earlier colonial offenses against the natives. The Native Confederation within Canada was protected land for natives, where other Canadians were not to settle. Canada is a North American superpower by virtue of their industrialized nature, often being called the Prussia of the Americas, by virtue of their highly professional and modernized armies. The Canadian Navy, especially when combined with the British Navy, completely dominates the American continent, making Canada, arguably, the strongest North American state despite their relatively small population. Finally, there is the United States, which is a mix between the other two. Democratic, but still dominated by an aristocratic, almost noble-like southern class of plantation owners. As with the departure of New England, the South now decidedly outnumbered the northern states. Slavery remains a common practice within the nation, although it is on a slow decline. The northeast of the nation has still developed an impressive industry, but on the whole, the US is the black sheep of the continent, as Britain, Canada and Mexico have relatively good relations with each other, while nobody really likes the United States. Wars across the world would continue to shape the North American continent, the most notable of which being the Crimean War. Britain got into conflict with the Russians, but initially they didn't call the Canadians into the war, as Britain did not want to risk America joining the Russian side. Canada then decided all by themselves to get involved anyways, occupying Russian Alaska and harassing the Russian Far Eastern territories. During the peace negotiations, Canada and Britain refused to allow a peace deal where Canada did not gain Alaska. But while the US didn't get involved on the Russian side, they did take this opportunity of Britain and Canada being distracted by seizing Spanish Cuba and Puerto Rico, while also invading Haiti. While these invasions went by mostly uncontested, Mexico would spend the following decades supporting secessionist movements on these islands, tying up many resources for the US. As compensation for their voluntary involvement in the Crimean War, Canada got to purchase all British territory in North America and the Caribbean, giving Canada a stake in the Caribbean conflict between Mexico and the United States. But now, across the sea, the European continent is heating up, as Germany is starting to assert itself on the world stage. The forming of more rigid alliance structures is building up pressure for a major conflict soon to come. We now stand at the precipice of a major turn on the North American continent, as Germany attempts to recruit Mexico to their side by virtue of their shared aristocratic beliefs, while attempting to sway the United States by promises of rectifying the consequences of the War of the Nations, and then some. Our three North American superpowers now stand on the crossroads, and while Canada's allegiance to Britain, and thus the Entente, is uncontested, only time will tell which way the other two superpowers go, and how the North American continent will look once the dust of the coming conflict settles. But that's it for this alternate history. A bit different to what I normally do, but I do hope you enjoyed it nonetheless. With that, I will thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed the content, leave a like and a comment to help out against the algorithm, subscribe for 2 more videos every single week, and if you enjoyed the content, consider clicking on one of the videos on screen now to continue watching. Again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.